Hello, today I'm going to be talking about our new Ignite UI Page Designer. And as you can see, it's based on HTML5. So what is the Ignite UI Page Designer today? Simply put, it's a WYSIWYG, that's what you see is what you get, designer for advanced modern web line of business applications that use Ignite UI. Our key use cases for version 1 are to lay out and configure pages that use Ignite UI components, to create and use responsive web design breakpoints with Bootstrap Grid layout support, and to easily configure and learn to master Ignite UI components using select HTML and Bootstrap components as well in the process. Obviously, this is just a version 1, so we would love to hear your feedback. In fact, that's really what we're after here with this public preview, both in terms of getting your help, making sure that all the bases are covered in terms of any issues you might find, but also, more importantly, what you think of it, what you want to see next, where you see it going. Obviously, we have ideas about that, but we really would like your input. So there's ideas.infragistics.com is our generic Infragistics website for you to submit ideas. There's also a link I'll show you in the menu of the tool itself that will get you specifically to the form for this tool. So without further ado, we will get to showing you this. Again, this is Ignite UI based on Infragistics jQuery UI controls. It's not limited to that. However, we have definitely spent time optimizing those controls for the purposes of this tool. So what you see here is what you would probably see after coming to designer.igniteui.com. We've got a nice little welcome message for you. I've had this window up for a few minutes. You'll see this come up during the preview, the beta testing that we're doing. We would love to get your feedback. So, if you see this come up and you're not quite ready yet, please go ahead and choose Take the Survey. It'll just pop up a window, and you can take it when you're actually done using the tool. But we don't hit you with it right away. I just have had this window open for a little bit. Anyways, without further ado, let's get to it. So I'll just go, got it. And now you have your design surface. Some things you'll see over here on the right is our toolbox. There's a lot of stuff in there, and that's because there's a lot of stuff in Ignite UI. You'll also see things like Bootstrap. So we have some Bootstrap components, and we've also got some HTML components here. One of the interesting things about some of these HTML components, for instance, is if you drop a container, you can actually change what kind of container it is, and you can see we've got most of the HTML5 container types. And that just helps you, so if you decide you wanted to do an article, it will actually change the tag to be an article tag as opposed to something else. So this is a code view. We'll get back to that soon enough, but I just wanted to mention that even though you don't see specific things like div and so forth, we're just sort of wrapping all those so we don't have a bloated toolbox. And you'll see that pattern with some of these other things as well, so just keep that in mind. Now, before we get into specific components, just wanted to give you a brief overview of kind of what's in there. We got a lot of editors and inputs, lots of rich data visualization components. The chart has tons of different series. You can learn about all of these on igniteui.com and browse the samples there and see what it's like to code with them and that sort of thing. What we're doing with this designer, in addition to just helping you do layout and initially build your pages, is we're helping people actually learn to use and effectively use the Ignite UI components. So you will see that as we go through the presentation today. The menu over here on the bottom left, you'll see a few things in here about that just takes you to information, obviously. Share your ideas. So that's the thing I was mentioning earlier. We would love for you to send us your ideas for improvement. As I said before, we have a lot of ideas about where we could go with this and probably where we will go with it, but we definitely need feedback on what's important to you, what's more important versus less important. So the ideas.infragistics.com site has the ability for you to put votes, and you can kind of put more votes towards things that you're more interested in. Report an issue, that will take you to our form so you can actually submit bugs that you may run into. This is beta testing, and of course any software product has the potential for bugs, but we want to make it easy to report that. So you just go there, put a forum post in, tell us as best you can what you were doing, and we'll get back with you on that. And system requirements, I'll just go ahead and click that. You can see, this is a modern web tool, so, and you're all, it's targeted at developers, so, we assume that you're going to have a modern desktop browser to use it. That means it won't work on like the iPad. It's not touch enabled. We haven't focused on that. It's definitely more of a desktop tool. We've got, obviously, you have to use JavaScript, stuff like that. And then just remember, this is an early preview, so please keep that in mind. Now, below here, you'll see information on like design time code dependencies. These are things that we're reliant on to make the designer and all the components work. Normally, you don't have to worry about all this, but it's here in case something gets messed up. You can kind of easily fix things and go back. And then lastly, remember that this is based on Ignite UI, which is a commercial library. So even though you can definitely grab this and start developing with it, in order to be properly licensed, you're going to want to go and download. Also, when you download the full product from igniteui.com, you can get more information, more samples, they ship with that, and all the different files and things like that. So definitely I would recommend that if you're going to use this and you haven't already done those. So that's that. Now let's get down to it. What I want to do here is just, first of all, I'll show you starting some of the layout stuff. You can see here, you can choose to not use a grid / layout framework, but we'll just use Bootstrap. It's a very popular framework for doing layout, and by default what we do is we drop a Bootstrap row on there and we set it up with a 444. Now Bootstrap is all based on 12 column layouts. It's a very common approach to column based layouts, and what we let you do basically is choose from a lot of different common combinations. We're going to go ahead and go with 3.9. It kind of gives you the left side area and then the main area, and you'll see why this is kind of useful here in a minute. But now you have these targets that you can drop things into, and we'll go ahead and grab the tree. So we've got our tree here. It's a Ignite UI component, and we'll just drop it right there. And then we'll go ahead and grab our grid, and we'll stick that on the right side here. Now you may have noticed this grid comes pre-configured with some sample data. Obviously you can override that, and I'll show you one way to do that as we go through this. But let's go ahead and get into doing a little bit of customization on this. I have over here, you can see some of the defaults are not the default, so if it's highlighted like that, false, we're not actually generating the columns in the sample. We have the height set and things like that. As you might expect with an advanced property grid like this, you have things like the ability to toggle values, so you can do that just by clicking on those. If it's an enum, we actually give you the options. As you probably know, in JavaScript, enum doesn't technically really exist, so this is string based normally that you would specify in code, but here you can just use a drop down. At the same time, you might be noticing the little tooltips. So when you hover over these, we actually are pulling in our API docs and showing them right there so that you can get a better idea of what each of these are. So a lot of what we're doing here is helping people to become more familiar and comfortable with these advanced components and all the options that you can use on them. Now I could drill in here, for instance, and go look at all the columns. And you see I've got all the columns there, and we could actually drill into those and do editing on individual columns rather than doing all of this in code. So I think it really makes it significantly easier to configure and set up these, especially these advanced components. Now, what I wanted to do here though is to show you a way that you can configure a different data source. So I'm just going to grab this Northwind data source, drop it down here. You can see it's got the ability to edit schema and things like that, and you can actually drill into all the various events and properties. We're just going to leave it as its default right now, which is using the OData sample data for Northwind. And then we'll go back over here to the grid and just switch it over. So we find the data source. Oh, I didn't mention, but you can also search, and it'll filter both the events and properties, so it's a lot easier sometimes to find things that way. in order to find maybe the property or whatever that you're interested in. So I'm just going to pick Northwind data source. Now, what you're seeing here is by default we drop this on and we have some column configuration set up just to get this grid looking the way it does. But when you assign a new data source, probably the same columns are not going to be right. So you can keep those by all means and then go into the code and manually change them, or go in and edit the columns this way. But we're just going to go ahead and clear and auto-generate. So this is kind of more like the default grid behavior in the sense of looking at your data source and then trying to infer things from it. What I want to do on this is to go ahead and clean up some of those names on the headers. So I'll just drill in, for instance, on customer ID. And actually, this is the ID, so we don't really need to see that. So we'll just switch that to true. You can see immediately the grid refreshes, and you no longer see that one. Of course, you can still edit it if you want. And for company name, I'll just go ahead and put a nice space in there. And we'll go in and do the same thing for contact name. Just put a space in there. So the point here is that you can see how you drill in and you can actually manage your columns using a pretty handy, nice editor. So now we've cleaned that up a little bit. We've got a decent data source. We've got the height set to a decent amount. So we want to look at some of these features. So if we go and we click to configure the features on the grid, you'll actually see by default we've enabled these very common features. You can obviously trash them if you don't want them. You can drill in and actually see what the particular options are for each filter. So if I go into filtering, you can see it's a very similar interface to the standard component interface, but these are all specific options for the filtering feature. You can see here you can actually change the text of some of these things. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how you can configure features using the grid. And now, before we move on, I figure I'll just go ahead and show you a preview here. And let's put that in the video there. And you can totally do some kind of filtering here. You can decide you want to sort, ascending, descending. You can see we have the paging in here. So all of that is just standard grid stuff, but the thing we're seeing here is that it's a preview. So when you're in here on the design surface, we've got stuff on top of it, like these little things that tell you what kind of component they are, and when you click on them, they'll show the editor. So basically, it's a very familiar concept, right? You do a preview or F5 it or whatever you're familiar with, and you can actually see what it will be like for the end user to use it. So that's that. Now, I also wanted to show another component real quick here. We'll just drop a chart onto the surface, and you can see by default we've got these series set up. I show you some information. It's all this is just built-in chart functionality. You saw the animation, and again, you've got all of the different stuff in terms of properties, options, and events that you can go in and edit here. Now, if I wanted to, I could go ahead and change the data source and change the axis. Currently, you have to manually edit it, but in order to do that, you can do the design time experience. So you can actually drill in and see your axes, and you can go into the name axis and change its values so that it would show the way that you want it to show, or you can just delete them and add your own. You can also, though, switch over to the code view, and you can see here this is an actual just standard HTML page with links to styles, links to JavaScripts. You can literally copy all, I should say, and copy this and paste it into a local HTML file, and it'll all work, and you can just move forward with life and integrate that into your project. And so that's kind of the workflow we envision for the current version. Is you come in here, you'll set some things up, you'll configure your grid or whatever, and then you can just grab that code and run with it in your project. It's not a full-fledged IDE at this point. It's just a way for you to more easily get going with a lot of these complex components And you can also manually edit code. So if you wanted to go in to the grid here, you just hit that, and you can actually see what what options are, and we'll actually show you the specific options. And again, we're integrating the API help as well. So your choices are basically you can edit it in the GUI and in the WYSIWYG kind of way. You can also come in here and get good support for IntelliSense as well, and auto completion. So it's pretty handy in terms of the different options that you have. You're not left having to manually consult everything all the time. And you can see this is standard stuff. So we have the document ready function that you're used to if you're doing jQuery development. You can see here we've set up this data source, and that's the one that we ended up assigning to the grid. So I'm not going to spend much more time on the code here, but I just wanted to make you aware that we do have a fully functional code editor as well as the WYSIWYG, and it's all clean code. That's a key thing for us, is so when you take this, you have minimal work to integrate it into your projects. Same thing for the tree. We could go ahead and configure that. Basically, any of these components, you drop them on, you configure them, and you can run with it. So one other thing that I wanted to show you is the built-in responsive design support. So part of the responsive design is the Bootstrap stuff. It has built-in breakpoints. So once you hit a certain point, it will actually go ahead and relay out. So you can see it went from a side-by-side to a stacked version of these columns. What I wanted to show you though is we actually go beyond that, like the built-in stuff, and we actually let you define your own breakpoints. Now, breakpoint, is a very overloaded word. It's not my fault, but that's just the word that is used for dealing with responsive web design breakpoints. I mean, that's basically saying at this point, based on some value, you want to apply different CSS. That's essentially the concept. So we'll go ahead and add a tablet breakpoint, and you can see a couple things happened here. We automatically shrink it down to the tablet point of view, the width, and this is just a guess. It's not like definitely this is for all tablets going to be your width, and depending on whom you talk to, they don't want you to use specific like tablet or whatever names, shall we say. So you could say, instead of tablet, let's call this medium or stacked or whatever. The point being that instead of thinking about specific devices, you're actually thinking about how your content flows once it reaches certain widths, for instance. And of course you can change the widths in here. You can delete, so I'll just save that, and now it's the medium breakpoint instead of the tablet breakpoint, so you can name them. That's not actually a built-in feature to responsive design or CSS. We're just supporting that through some commenting I'll show you in a second. But you can toggle, so if you wanted to go like the default styles versus the ones that are specific to this breakpoint, and you can see how they look. We're not bothering to wrap it in like a pretty shell, a fake shell. We're trying not to distract people with unnecessary stuff like that. We're just focused on these values here, and you might see like when you get here you can actually change the breakpoints, so that will literally change what the breakpoint values are. Okay, so the last thing that I wanted to show you briefly is the class support for responsive web design. So a common thing in responsive web design is to change, for instance, the size of the font as things get smaller or bigger. See, all I did here was basically drop a heading and a text on there, and I added a couple breakpoints. So I've got the phone breakpoint and I've got the tablet breakpoint. So I'll just pick the phone breakpoint, and I want to make this title just a tad smaller because it's going to take up a lot of space on the phone. So I select it and I choose to double click to create a class. Now what you see here is it's actually added the class inside of the phone breakpoint for you, so you don't have to manually go and find that and do that in code. It just does it for you. And what we can do is set the font size to be something smaller, like probably 1.8 rem is probably good. So if we switch back over to design, you see it's actually significantly smaller, and that's the correct measurement. But if we go back and we pick another breakpoint, it goes back to the same size, and we could repeat that process for all of these. But the interesting thing is just that we're adding these styles inside the correct currently selected breakpoint for you. So that's everything that we're doing here in this version 1. I didn't obviously drill into all the components, but hopefully as you use them you'll find this useful. I'd just like to reiterate that if you see any problems, you please report an issue. And if you want to suggest new stuff, you can definitely share new ideas for improvement. So thank you for watching, and we hope you enjoy the test period, and please let us know what you think. Thank you.